Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today we have an episode of Commander's 2 Cents. On episodes like these, I give you my own personal take on topics about the format in general and current news. This show and episodes like this one are possible because of viewers like you. So if you're looking for some easy ways to help support the show, make sure you like this episode and share it with friends. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Another easy way to support this channel is by using our TCG Player affiliate links. So make sure that you're looking for those links in the description whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Today's episode is going to be about some Commander deck archetypes. A deck archetype is a recurring kind of deck or strategy that has many possible variations. An archetype might also be referred to as a theme in some places too. There are far too many archetypes for me to tackle in one episode, so we're just going to go through a few today. I'm going to give you a broad definition of the archetype, some commanders that may be built within that archetype, and some cards that are typically seen in that archetype as well. Keep in mind that these are all my opinions about these archetypes and that opinions differ from person to person. But now that we're on the same page, let's get into it. First up, what's the Storm archetype? A Storm deck is a deck that works to cast a ton of spells in one turn. This can happen by generating a ton of mana or casting free spells or even reducing mana cost. Regardless, there's going to be some sort of payoff for casting all those spells in one turn. That payoff might happen while casting or after casting. Often the spells that you're casting really don't matter, it's just a means to the end. The more spells that you cast in a row, the more impactful that you can be. There are definitely a ton of different ways and commanders that you can build a Storm deck with. But let's just tackle a few of them to illustrate the archetype. First up, there's Mizzix of the Magnus, which might be the most used Storm commander. She has, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost greater than the number of experience counters you have, you get an experience counter. And then instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each experience counter you have. You can definitely take the Storm route of instants and sorceries with a commander like this. As I mentioned before, reducing the cost of spells can be huge for a Storm deck. Mizzix allows you to cast a ton of spells for cheap. Some of these instants and sorceries are going to give you extra mana, and others will draw you extra cards. And once you have enough experience counters, you can storm off pretty easily. Next up, there's Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. She has whenever you cast a historic spell, draw a card. Historic spells can be either artifacts, legendaries, or sagas. But for a Storm deck, you're definitely going to focus on artifacts. There are a decent amount of ways to reduce the cost of artifacts down to nothing. Then you can bounce those artifacts back to your hand and recast them. And remember, every single time you cast an artifact spell, you're going to be drawing a card. Once you're set up, she's an incredible value engine. If you want to see one of my versions of this deck in action, check out this Spike Feeders episode. There you can really see it take over and storm off. And then a newer commander like Kaikar can definitely be used as a Storm commander too. It says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying, and sacrifice a spirit to add red. So this commander is definitely your source of free mana. And it counts all non-creature spells, so you can use artifacts, instant or sorceries, or whatever non-creature spell you want. But now let's go through some cards that you might see in a Storm build. Like I mentioned before, some Storm builds are looking to generate a ton of mana in one turn. So ritual spells like Seething Song can come in huge and keep you going. Many Storm decks are also looking to cast their spells more than once in the same turn. So a card like Past in Flames can come in huge to help you do that. It gives all of your instants and sorceries in your graveyard flashback until end of turn. On top of that, if you need to flash it back again, you can. Now, casting all these spells is great, but you need some kind of a benefit from it. That's where something like Aetherflux Reservoir comes in handy. It says whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn. And then you can pay 50 life, and Aetherflux Reservoir is going to deal 50 damage to target creature or player. So the more spells you cast, the more life you gain, and then you can use that life to kill your opponents. Now, there are plenty of variations of Storm builds, but you typically see them in blue-red. In these colors, there are plenty of instants and sorceries that have a very low mana cost and work fantastic in Storm builds. These colors also have great interactions with artifacts too. There are plenty of different ways that you can take a Storm build. But now that we've gone through Storm, let's go on to our next archetype. So what exactly is the +1/+1 counter archetype? It's going to be a deck that adds a lot of +1/+1 counters onto its creatures. It seems like a pretty straightforward archetype, but there are definitely different ways you can take it. In some decks, you're going to be building up just one or a few creatures, and in other decks, you're going to be working to build up your entire team. One commander that can definitely go in that direction is Atraxa Praetor's Voice. She has at the beginning of your end step, Proliferate. So by doing that, you can put another counter on any of your creatures that already has a counter. Now, Atraxa can definitely be built into a lot of different decks outside of +1/+1 counters, but with her ease to add counters, she can be very effective in this archetype. A commander that might go in a different direction is Varel the Hulkblade. It has pay green, blue, and tap it, double the number of each kind of counter on target artifact, creature, or land. So with this commander, it's probably going to be less of a go-wide strategy. For the most part, you're going to keep doubling up the counters on either one or a few creatures. Another kind of +1/+1 counters build you can see with a commander like Rishkar. When he enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. And then every single creature you control with a counter on it has tap, add green to your mana pool. So this deck might go wide, but it might not be worried about having a ton of counters on each creature, because each one of your creatures only needs 1 counter on them to tap for mana. You can use all that mana to cast some huge spells to take over the game. Those spells might give your creatures even more counters, but they don't have to. So like I said before, this seems like a very straightforward strategy, but you can definitely take it in a few different ways. But there are definitely some cards that you're going to see consistently in these types of decks. Hardened Scales is a fantastic card for this archetype. It says if one or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a creature you control, that many +1 are put on it instead. So an effect like this just benefits you even more from doing what you're already doing. And then there are cards like Fathom Mage which benefit whenever counters go on them. In the case of Fathom Mage, it's going to draw you a card whenever a +1/+1 counter is put onto it. So in the right deck, this can be a huge value engine for you. And finally, a card like Simic Ascendancy can be a great secondary win condition. It says whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. With the right build, it takes absolutely no time at all to win the game with this. There are variations of +1/+1 counters builds, but typically you see them in blue and green. Simic is a great color pair when it comes to getting counters on creatures and getting more and more. But with that, let's move on to our next archetype. So our third archetype for today is the Group Hug archetype. In my opinion, a Group Hug deck is a deck that works to help others and works not to lose. Now there's definitely some debate about this archetype in particular, because unlike pretty much every other archetype, this one actually doesn't really want to win. Now I actually already built a Feldergrift deck that many people might see as a Group Hug deck, but I don't. I consider that deck to be a political control deck. Unlike a Group Hug deck, it's working to win, although it might not seem to be. In my opinion, to be considered a true Group Hug deck, the deck cannot be working to win. Essentially, a Group Hug deck is going to be working to help the players that are behind and to help them not to lose. While it's doing that, it's going to be protecting itself too. Many people actually don't like to play against Group Hug decks because they can be some very long games. To illustrate this though, let's go through some of the commanders that you might see in a Group Hug strategy. First up, there's Kineos and Tiro. They have, at the beginning of your end step, draw a card. Each player may put a land card from his or her hand onto the battlefield, then each opponent who didn't draws a card. So essentially with your commander out, you're benefiting everyone. And then there's Sovala, Explorer Returned. She has Parlay, tap. Each player reveals the top card of their library. For each non-land card revealed this way, add green to your mana pool and you gain 1 life, then each player draws a card. So again, you're getting slightly more of a benefit, but still every player is benefiting from you doing this. And finally, there's Feldergrift, which I mentioned before. Even though I don't use Feldergrift as a Group Hug commander, it can definitely be used in that way. You can use it to draw people cards, gain them life, or give them hippos. So if a player's behind, you can really help them out with this commander. If someone attacks them, give them some hippos. If they're about to die, gain them life. And if they have an empty hand, give them some cards. But let's go through some cards that you might see in a Group Hug strategy. Rites of Flourishing is another card that's going to benefit everyone. It draws everyone an extra card each turn, and it lets them play an additional land. Again, while benefiting players though, a Group Hug deck is going to work on protecting itself. Politics can definitely be used for this, but things like Ghostly Prison can be even more effective. It says creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature he or she controls that's attacking you. In order to protect the other players, you need to protect yourself first. And then they can use a card like Fractured Identity to try to even the playing field. It says exile target non-land permanent. Each player other than its controller creates a token that's a copy of it. So if someone's ahead, you take their best non-land permanent and you give it to everyone else. Now typically for Group Hug decks, you're going to see the colors of white, blue, and green. These colors have plenty of ways to benefit others and to keep other players in check. Again, there's plenty of debate about what the exact definition of a Group Hug deck is. And I'll say this again, but this is just my opinion on what this kind of a deck is. If a deck is actively trying to win, it's not a Group Hug deck. There are other archetypes that are similar but do try to win. But we can cover those some other time. For now, let's move on to our last archetype of the day. And that would be the Stacks archetype. Now this is definitely oversimplifying it, but here's my definition. A Stacks deck is a deck that works to deny resources and break symmetry. With this kind of a deck, you're trying to lock down your opponents and make it really difficult for them to do anything. You can tax everyone to the point that they can't cast spells. You can blow up everyone's lands or prevent them from using their mana rocks. For the most part, you're going to be playing some cards that really hinder everyone and slow things down. But you're also going to have some ways to work around those so you're not hindered as much or at all. In simple terms, some people say that Stacks decks are actively working to prevent you from playing Magic. So much like Group Hug decks, there are people out there that don't like playing against either of these archetypes. But there are plenty of people out there that are fine with it too. As always though, I encourage you to have a discussion before you start a game. Make sure that everyone's on the same page and knows the expectations of play. Although it might get a bad reputation with some, there are plenty of people out there that are fine playing with and against this kind of a deck. But with that, let's go through some commanders that you might use in a Stacks build. First up, there's Derevi, Imperial Tactician. It says whenever it enters the battlefield or a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may tap or untap target permanent. It also allows you to avoid commander tax by paying 1 green, white, blue and putting it directly onto the battlefield from the command zone. We'll go through this later, but you're probably going to be playing some artifacts that you actually want to tap. That way they only affect your opponents and not you. And tapping down key permanents, including lands, can be very effective too. Next up, there's Grand Arbiter Augustine IV. It says white spells cost you 1 less to cast, blue spells cost you 1 less to cast, and spells your opponents control cost 1 more to cast. So effectively, you reduce the cost of your own spells while taxing your opponents. And even a commander like Zur the Enchanter can be very effective in a Stacks build. If you want to see how I built around Zur, go ahead and check out this episode on the Professor's channel. But now let's go through some cards that you might see in a stacks build. First up, there's Winter Orb, which says, as long as Winter Orb is untapped, players can't untap more than one land during their untapped steps. So again, this is a card that denies resources, but you can break symmetry just by tapping it. And then there's Aura of Silence, which is going to tax your opponents on their artifacts and enchantment spells. On top of that, you can sacrifice it if you need to take out an artifact or enchantment. And finally, there's a card like Smokestack, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a suit counter on Smokestack. And then at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a permanent for each suit counter on Smokestack. Again, resource denial and slowing down your opponents is huge for stacks decks. So for the most part in stacks builds, you're going to see white and blue. Both of these colors can be great at controlling the board and slowing things down. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really want to hear from you. In the comments below, let me know what your favorite archetype is. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.